I'm 42, and up until 2 months ago, I thought I knew everything about my family. I've always been the keeper of our history, the one who organizes old photo albums, digitizes VHS tapes, and keeps my late mom's letters in acid-free boxes. My dad, now 70, has lived in the same house for over 40 years, and I thought I'd been through every corner of it. But then my dad asked me to help clear out the attic before the roofers came, and that's when everything started unraveling. We'd been sorting through dusty suitcases and boxes full of Christmas decorations when I found an old duct-taped box shoved behind the insulation near the far wall. It wasn't labeled, which was unusual for my dad. He's the kind of person who puts masking tape and a Sharpie label on literally everything, down to bags of screws. I called down the ladder to ask him about it, but he didn't answer right away. When he finally came up, he just froze, staring at the box like he'd seen a ghost. I asked if it was his, and he said, "Just put it back. It's nothing." But his voice was shaking, and that made me curious, probably too curious. When I told him we needed to move it before the roofers came, he hesitated and then muttered, "Fine, but don't go through it." Of course, that made me want to go through it more. It wasn't heavy, but when I set it down on the floorboards, I heard something rattling inside, not like coins or screws, more like glass. The cardboard was soft with age, and as I peeled the duct tape back, I noticed the box smelled faintly of old perfume and cigarette smoke. My dad stood behind me, not saying a word, just watching. He was waiting for something bad to happen. Inside, there were old Polaroids wrapped in yellowed tape, a stack of letters tied with fraying blue ribbon, and a small tin with a lock that had long since rusted. The first Polaroid I pulled out stopped me cold. It was my mom, but younger than I'd ever seen her, maybe early 20s, standing in front of a neon-lit bar I didn't recognize, with her arm around a man I had never seen before, and she was pregnant, very pregnant. When I looked up at my dad, he wasn't looking at me, he was looking at the photo, his face pale. That's when he said, "That's not me." I just sat there on the attic floor, staring at that photo like it might suddenly explain itself if I looked hard enough. My mom had died when I was 20, and in all the years since, no one had ever hinted at her having a life before my dad. Not like this. Sure, I knew they hadn't met until their late 20s, but this was different. This was her, visibly pregnant, smiling like she didn't have a care in the world, with a man I didn't recognize. My dad didn't try to take the picture away. He just lowered himself onto an old milk crate and put his head in his hands. I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to demand answers right there in the attic, but something about the way he was breathing, slow and shaky, made me think maybe he'd been dreading this moment for years. Finally, I broke the silence and asked, "Whose baby was she carrying?" My voice cracked halfway through the sentence. My dad didn't answer. He just told me, "Look at the letters." The bundle of ribbon-tied envelopes felt fragile, like they might crumble if I wasn't careful. They weren't addressed to my mom under her married name. They were to Clara James, a name I'd never heard her use. Postmarks ranged from 1980 to 1983. Every return address was from the same city I'd never known she'd lived in. The handwriting was messy, almost rushed, and the first letter started with "My Clara," not "Dear Clara," just "My Clara," like she belonged to him. It was clear from the first few lines that they weren't just dating. Whoever he was, he loved her. There were mentions of "our little one," "the day you move in," and even plans for starting fresh somewhere no one knows us. Somewhere between the second and third letter, my hands started shaking. The words "our little one" hit differently when you've never known about another child. My dad was still silent, watching me, until I finally asked if my mom had had a baby before me. He didn't answer that either. Instead, he reached for the tin. When he forced the rusted lock open, inside was a hospital bracelet, tiny enough for a newborn, and a Polaroid of a baby swaddled in a yellow blanket. On the back, written in the same messy handwriting from the letters, were 3 words, "For Clara's heart." And that's when my dad whispered, his name was Michael. The name Michael sat in the air like dust, refusing to settle. I'd never heard it connected to my family before, but my dad said it like he'd been carrying it around for decades. I wanted to ask who Michael was. A brother? Half-brother? My mom's child from before she met my dad? But my voice wouldn't work. My dad took the tin from my hands and stared at the photo of the baby for so long, I thought he might never speak again. When he finally did, his words came out slow, like they were being dragged out of him. He said he met my mom in 1986, years after all of that had happened. She was already living in our town, working at the public library, and she didn't talk much about her past. He knew she'd had a relationship before him, but she told him the man had left, and that it was better to leave it behind. It wasn't until after they got married that she told him she'd been pregnant once. According to him, Michael was her first child, born in 1981, and the man in the Polaroid was his father. My mom and this man had lived together in a small apartment above a pawn shop in a city a few hours away. My dad said it wasn't a good situation, though he wouldn't explain why, and that the man disappeared before Michael was born. The way he told it, my mom was left with no money, no job, and a newborn. After a few months of trying to make it work, she gave Michael up for adoption. It was a closed adoption, my dad said. She never saw him again. He spoke like he was reciting facts from a police report. No emotion, no speculation, but I could see his hands trembling as he put the bracelet back in the tin. Something about his story didn't sit right with me. If it had been such a closed chapter, why was the box hidden away in the attic instead of just thrown out years ago? Why did he look like he was bracing for a punch when I first found it? And then there was the timeline. The letters were dated all the way up to 1983. 2 years after Michael was supposedly born, and they weren't the kind of letters someone writes if they've abandoned. They were filled with apologies for the wait, promises about getting everything ready for you and the baby, and references to being together soon. It didn't sound like when I pointed that my dad's jaw. He said the man was not who I think he should just let it go. But the more he talked, the more I realized he wasn't giving me a complete story. He was giving me his version of it. I pressed him again, asking why my mom's letters if she'd supposedly moved on. Shook his head and she was human, that explained. I left that night with the box in my backseat. My dad didn't try to stop me. In fact, when I told him I wanted to know more about Michael, he said something that made my stomach not. Be careful, you might not like what you find. When I got home, I spread everything out on my dining table. The letters, the photos, the tin, and started reading every single letter in order. I stayed up until nearly 3 a.m., and by the time I finished the last one, I realized 2 things. 1, the man who wrote them had never stopped trying to find my mom. 2, his last letter ended with a date and a place, one I recognized. It was the name of a diner in our town. And the date? Just 3 weeks before my mom married my dad. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my mom in that Polaroid, hand resting on her pregnant belly, leaning into a man I didn't know. I kept thinking about the last letter, the one that mentioned meeting at the diner. The address was scribbled at the bottom in that same rushed handwriting, and the name hit me immediately, Monroe's Diner. It's still around, a small, greasy spoon place that's been in business forever. I've eaten there dozens of times. My mom used to take me there when I was little for pancakes on Saturday mornings. I never thought much of it, but now I couldn't shake the idea that maybe it meant something more. By noon the next day, I was in my car, the box still riding shotgun. Monroe's looked exactly the same as I remembered. The faded red awning, the neon open sign that flickers even in broad daylight, the smell of coffee and frying bacon that hits you before you even open the door. I grabbed a booth by the window and ordered coffee, my mind racing. I didn't know exactly what I was looking for. Some old waitress who remembered my mom, a regular who'd been coming for decades. Anything. When my waitress, a woman in her 50s with a name tag that said Fran, came to refill my cup, I took a I asked if she'd worked there. She smiled and said she'd been serving coffee there since 19. That was all I knew. I slid the last Polaroid across the table, the one of my mom and then in front of the bar, and asked if she'd ever seen either of them. Fran's expression changed instantly. She stared at the photo for a long moment, then at me, and I could see something click behind her eyes. She didn't say anything right away. Instead, she asked me where I'd gotten it. I told her my mom was the woman in the picture. That was when she let out this little sigh and said she remembered them, not from the bar, but from here. She said they used to come in together all the time, even before my mom was showing, and they weren't just customers. They were the kind of couple people noticed. He always pulled her chair out, kept his hand on hers while they talked. They looked like they belonged together, she said. I asked if she knew what happened to him. Fran hesitated, then said she didn't know the full story, just that one day he showed up alone. She thought maybe they'd broken up, but here's the part that made my stomach drop. She remembered the date of the last time she saw him, because it was the day he got kicked out. When I asked what she meant, Fran explained that my dad, yes, my dad, had come into the diner that day, walked right up to their table, and told the man to leave town. Fran said it wasn't a loud scene, but it was tense enough that everyone nearby stopped eating. The man left without arguing. My mom sat there crying into her coffee. Fran never saw him again. And here's the thing. The date she remembered was the exact same date written on the last letter, which means my dad didn't just know about it. He made sure he disappeared. I drove straight from the diner to my dad's house, without even thinking it through. My hands were gripping the steering wheel so hard they ached, my mind replaying every word Fran had said. The image of my dad standing over that man in Monroe's, telling him to leave town, wouldn't stop looping in my head. When I walked into his kitchen, he was sitting at the table reading the paper like it was any other day. He didn't even look up until I dropped the Polaroid on top of the sports section. I told him I'd been to Monroe's. I told him Fran remembered them. I told him I knew he was there the day of the meeting, in that last letter. He didn't deny it. He didn't even look surprised. He just folded the paper slowly and said, "You should stop digging." That was the second time he'd told me to let it go, but now it sounded different, less like advice and more like a threat wrapped in concern. I asked him point blank what he'd said to the man. My dad's jaw clenched. He said he told him to leave and never come back, that my mom was moving on, that there was no place for him here anymore. I asked why he felt he had the right to decide that. His answer made my skin crawl. Because I was protecting her, he said. According to him, the man had trouble following him around. He wouldn't say what that meant exactly. only that the guy wasn't safe. When I pressed for details, he cut me off and said some people don't change, and that if I tracked this man down, I'd regret it. I told him if the man was so dangerous, why keep all his letters and photos in the attic instead of destroying them? My dad looked away, staring out the window like he was somewhere else entirely. After a long pause, he said, because she wouldn't let me. That hit me harder than anything. My mom had wanted to keep them. She'd hidden them where he couldn't get to them, and when she died, he must have found them but couldn't bring himself to throw them out. I asked if he knew where the man was now. He said he had no idea, and hoped I never would. Then he added something that chilled me. If you do find him, don't tell him who you are. I left before I said something I couldn't take back, but by the time I got to my car, I'd already made up my mind. I was going to find him, not because I wanted to cause trouble, but because I couldn't live the rest of my life knowing there was someone out there who might be my brother's father or my brother himself. That night, I pulled the letters back out and looked at every return address, every postmark. The first few years they were all from the same city, but the last one before the diner had a different return address, a P.O. box in a small town 2 hours away. And tucked in one of the envelopes, folded so small I'd almost missed it, was something I hadn't seen before, a faded business card for a used car dealership with a name printed on it. Not my mom's, not my dad's, his. The business card was worn soft at the edges, the ink faded, but still readable. Harlan Price. Price Auto Sales. No phone number, just an address in a town I'd never had a reason to visit. I sat there staring at it, the name feeling strangely heavy in my hands. Harlan. I'd never heard my mom say it, never seen it on a scrap of paper, yet now it felt like the missing piece to everything I'd been uncovering. I started with the obvious. An online search. Price Auto Sales didn't exist anymore, at least not under that name. The address now belonged to a chain pharmacy, but buried in some archived business directory from the early 90s, I found a listing along with an old phone number. That led me to a comment thread on a local history Facebook where someone mentioned Harlan hired early and kept to himself after closing. It wasn't much, but it was enough. I made a burner social media account. No way was I letting my real name in any searches that could connect back to me. I joined that same local history group and casually posted about looking for an old friend named Harlan Price. Within an hour, someone replied that they thought he still lived in the outskirts of town, that weird blue house with the boarded up. It should have felt like a victory, but instead I just felt this deep unease. My dad's words kept replaying, if you do find, don't tell him. The next day, I drove out there. The town was small enough that the directions I got in a private message were all I needed. Past the gas station, left at the church, down a dirt road that looked like it hadn't seen a grader in decades. The house wasn't hard to spot. Faded blue paint, peeling in long strips, front steps sagging, windows smudged with dust. The place looked abandoned at first, until I saw the curtain in the front window twitch. I sat in my car for what felt like 10 minutes, trying to convince myself to get out. Then I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. Parked halfway behind the house, half hidden by weeds, was an old red pickup. It was ancient, rust creeping up the sides, but I recognized it instantly from the photos in my mom's box. Same model, same dent in the passenger side door. I'd barely taken 2 steps toward the porch when the front door creaked open. A man stood there, thin but not frail, late 60s mate, with sharp eyes that seemed to size me up in an instant. He didn't say hello. He didn't ask who I was. He just looked past me, scanning the road, like he was checking to see if I'd brought someone with. Then, in a voice that was more statement than question, he said, "You're Clara's kid." The way he said it, flat, certain, froze me on the bottom step. I hadn't told him my name, hadn't even mentioned my mom, yet he knew. I asked how, and Harlan just gave this half-smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Out her mouth," he said before stepping back and motioning me inside. The house smelled faintly of motor oil and old wood. There were stacks of newspapers by the door, dusty picture frames turned face down on a bookshelf, and a faint humming sound coming from somewhere deeper inside. He offered me coffee, but I couldn't imagine drinking anything here without feeling like I was crossing some invisible line. We sat at a kitchen table that like it hadn't been cleared in years. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, he leaned back and said, "So, I guess your dad told you I ran out on her." It wasn't a question. I nodded, careful not to reveal too much. "That's not what happened," he said. His voice was steady, but there was something underneath it, a kind of bitterness that had been simmering for decades. According to Harlan, he and my mom were together for almost 3 years. She got pregnant in early '81, and while it wasn't planned, he said they were both excited. He was working the dealership, she was waitressing, and they were saving to move into a better place. He even had a small plot of land picked out outside of town. Then, a few months before Michael was born, my dad showed, not in the friendly, "Hey, I'm your girlfriend's friend" kind of way. Harlan said he'd never met him before, but from the second they spoke, it was clear they lived, my mom worked, even which nights Harlan stayed late at the dealership. He claimed my dad told him, point blank, that he and my mom had history and that she'd already decided to leave. Harlan said he didn't believe it until a week later, when my mom suddenly stopped answering his calls. When Michael was born, Harlan tried to be. He swore my mom wanted him, said she even called him from the hospital when he showed up. The last time he saw her was at He said he'd been writing to her for months trying to get her to. But before they'd even finished their coffee, my dad walked. According to Harlan, my dad didn't raise his voice, didn't touch him, just said, "This is over," and something else Harlan. He swore that whatever my dad said in that moment broke her. She wouldn't look at him again. She left without finishing her coffee. 3 months later, a friend told him she'd moved and given the. When I asked him why he didn't fight for Michael, he just looked down at his hands. I tried, but every time I got close, something got in the way. Jobs fell through. My landlord threatened eviction. My truck got impounded. I can't prove it was him, but I've got my suspicions. I wanted to ask what he meant by that, but before I could, Harlan stood up and walked over to a drawer. He pulled out a plain white envelope and slid it across the table. Inside was a photo, newer than any in my mom's box. A teenage boy, maybe 17, with the same eyes as my mom. On the back, in shaky handwriting, it said, "Last time I saw him, 1998. Then Harlan looked me dead in the eye and said, "If you find him, you tell him I never stopped looking." I drove home with the photo face down on the passenger seat, like if I didn't look at it, the weight of it might be easier to bear. But every red light, every stop sign, my eyes flicked over. That boy, Michael, had my mom's eyes, Harlan's angular jaw, and an expression that seemed older than his years. I knew 1998 was more than 2 decades ago. He'd be in his 40s now. He could be anywhere. But I also knew that photo was proof he'd been alive and traceable at least once. I scanned it for any clue. Background signs, a school emblem, even the style of the photo paper. There was a faint shadow in the corner that looked like part of a street number, maybe from a building behind him. Then I saw it, a barely legible name printed on a sweatshirt. It looked like a high school name, Clearwater. That night, I was glued to my Clearwater High existed, but it was in another state, 3 states away actually. The yearbooks weren't digitized, but the alumni Facebook page. I joined under my burner account and started scrolling through old class photos. It took hours, but I found him. 1999 yearbook, junior class photo, same in the same sweatshirt. Underneath was the name Michael James, my mom's maiden name. Not Price, not my dad's last name, hers. I messaged one of the group's admins, claiming I was trying to reconnect with an old friend. She told me Michael had moved right after graduation and wasn't much for reunions. She didn't know where he was now, but gave me another name, someone she said was his best friend back then. I tracked that friend down on Instagram, public profile too. He had hundreds of photos, and I almost gave up scrolling until I saw it. A group picture from just last year. There was no caption, just a string of tagged usernames. One of them was albrism.james1979. I clicked through and froze. The profile was set to private, but the tiny circular profile picture was enough. It was him. Older, yes, but unmistakably him. And sitting next to him in that photo was a little girl, maybe 6 years old, with my mother's smile. I didn't send a request. Not yet, because the longer I stared, the more my stomach twisted. If I reached out, I wouldn't just be finding Michael. I'd be showing up in the life of someone who had no idea I existed, and my dad's warning suddenly didn't feel like paranoia. It felt like he'd been waiting for this moment and dreading what would happen next. I told myself I'd wait a few days before making any move. Time to think, to decide how much I was willing to risk by showing up in Michael's life. But waiting didn't stop the gnawing restlessness. Every time I passed the dining table where the box still sat, I'd catch sight of that envelope from Harlan and feel like I was holding a live wire. On the 3rd day, the decision was made for me. I came home from work to find my front door unlocked. My stomach dropped instantly. I always lock it, always. But I still went in, every nerve on high alert. The box was gone. Not just moved, not just shuffled around, gone. In its place on the table was a single sheet of paper, folded in half. No name, no greeting, just one line written in blocky, unfamiliar handwriting. "Stop digging before you lose more than you've already lost." I read it twice, 3 times, my pulse hammering in my ears. The obvious suspect was my dad, but the words didn't sound like him. He'd warned me, sure, but he didn't write like this, and he'd never break into my house. At least, I wanted to believe that. I called him anyway. He picked up on the 2nd ring, sounding tired, and when I demanded to know if he'd been in my house, he swore he hadn't. Said if he wanted to tell me to stop, he'd do it to my face. I almost believed him. Almost. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat in the dark with my laptop, pulling up Michael's profile again. My finger hovered over the follow button for a long time before I backed out. Whoever had been in my house clearly knew I was looking, maybe even knew about Michael, and the idea of tipping my hand made my skin crawl. But here's the thing. The next morning, when I checked his profile again, the follower count had gone up by 1. And the newest follower? My father. Seeing my father's name in Michael's follower list hit like a physical blow. I just sat there staring at it, my coffee going cold, trying to figure out what this meant. Either he'd known exactly where Michael was all along, or someone had tipped him off. maybe even Harlan. By noon, I decided I couldn't wait. I called my dad. He didn't answer the first 2 times, but on the third, he picked up with a clipped, "You need to stop." I told him I'd seen his name on Michael's account. He went silent for a long moment before saying, "It's better if you don't talk to him." I asked why, and he finally dropped the polite, fatherly tone. "Because he doesn't know the truth," he said. "Not about your mother, not about why she gave him up." My pulse was pounding, and I demanded he tell me, and what came out next wasn't anything I'd prepared for. According to my dad, my mom had never planned to give Michael up. She'd arranged to keep him, with Harlan in the picture, until the night before she was discharged from the hospital, when she found out Harlan had been arrested years earlier for something my dad wouldn't name. My dad claimed he'd confronted her, convinced her Michael would be safer with another family, and offered to handle everything. She signed the papers in tears. I didn't believe all of it, maybe not any of it, but before I could argue, my phone buzzed with an unknown number. I told my dad I'd call him back and picked up. "Is this," the voice hesitated, "Clara's daughter?" It was Michael. He said he'd gotten my number from someone who thought we should talk, and though he didn't say it, I knew it had to be Harlan. Michael's voice was calm but cautious. He told me he'd known he was adopted since he was a kid, but had never looked for his birth family until recently, when he'd stumbled across some old paperwork that listed my mom's maiden name. Then he said something that made my chest tighten. "I saw your profile picture. You look just like her." We talked for nearly an hour. I didn't tell him everything, not about the box being stolen, not about the break-in, but I did tell him about Harlan, about the letters, and about how our father's stories didn't match. Michael listened without interrupting. Finally, he said, "I don't know who's lying to you, but I do know this. I want to meet, just you and me, no one else." We set a time and place, a park halfway between our towns, in 2 days. After the call, I sat in the quiet of my kitchen, staring at my phone. I'd found him. After everything, the lies, the warnings, the years lost, I was about to meet my mother's first child, my brother. But as I was locking up for the night, I noticed something on my porch step, a plain envelope, no name, no return address. Inside was a single Polaroid of Michael holding the little girl from his profile picture, and on the back, in the same blocky handwriting as the note left in my house, were 5 words. "Don't let him near her." I didn't sleep at all that night, because for the first time since this started, I wasn't sure who I could trust, or whether meeting him would give me answers, or destroy what little I thought I knew.